Okay, I'm ready. So if we go, thank you. Well, good evening. Can you all hear me all right?
Yep. Thank you.
Yep.
Good. Good.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving up your evening to join me. And here we are for this talk based on research that I've been working on in some senses for almost all my life. And I at least for all bar about the first 15 years of it, because I first went to look at the battlefields of the Western campaign in France when I was about 16, 17 years old, and also some of the First World War battlefields that are obviously connected to the 1940 story, battlefields like Verdun. And I really did answer a question that was something closely related to this about the French defeat in 1940 in my Oxbridge entrance examination paper. I mean, it was an amazing chance that there was such a question on it. So I've been working on this for a long time, and I'm working on it now in retirement towards a book called The Republic at War, the French Army and Military Performance in 1940. So this is a bit of a snapshot of the themes of the book. I'll be very happy to take questions afterwards if we've got any, and if not, or if anybody thinks of anything afterwards, they can email me on that email address at the end, at the bottom, and I'll show that email address again in the last slide when we get there. So France and the West in war and defeat. Why did the West lose so badly and so quickly in 1940? Right. Why isn't my slide moving on? Okay, hopefully it will. The French, or many French authors and contemporaries, referred to 1940 not just as a defeat, but as a debacle. One very distinguished American historian, particularly of French fascism and of the Vichy collaborationist regime that followed the defeat, the regime of Marshal Pétain of 1940 to 44, wrote this about 10 years ago in the New York Review of Books. He said the debacle was really most characterized, most summed up by the images of a monumental traffic jam all across northern France, of weary pedestrians, laden peasant carts, jalopies, and retreating military. This, he said, was the most powerful image of the fall of France. But other images also stick with anyone who thinks about 1940. Defeated French soldiers, British troops, those of you who saw the recent film with Kenneth Branagh will remember it, British troops shuffling out into the waves at Dunkirk or along the jetty, the Mole, to be evacuated back to Britain. Pictures of surrender, pictures of demoralized and tired troops. So my proposition here is tired, for sure they were at the end of what was a very fast-moving 6-week-long military campaign from 10th of May to 25th of June 1940. Tired, yes. Demoralized, perhaps. Some of the troops, French and British, but certainly not all. Ready to surrender? I think perhaps not. The map on the right-hand slide, I hope you can see that, just shows the broad lines of the German offensive in 1940, and we'll look in a little more detail at further maps later on. But you'll see immediately there that it was based upon a right-wing feint to the north, the block of red marked with 4 offensive arrows moving westwards into the Netherlands and Belgium. The main thrust through the center, the cut of the sickle, as the Germans called that maneuver, and a largely holding German army to the south, facing what you can see as the sort of crenellated or castellated representation of the Maginot Line defenses along the Alsace and Lorraine border between France and Germany. But it's the French army which had the main responsibility for defending the West in 1940. Very simply, it was the biggest army by far. The Dutch army was about 10 divisions strong and had hoped to avoid fighting at all, as it had avoided through its neutrality in the First World War. Well, it was to be disabused of that at dawn on the 10th of May 1940 by Hitler's troops descending, including with parachute divisions, into the Netherlands, and by the bombing of Rotterdam by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. So the 10 Dutch divisions were poorly prepared, not fully mobilized, and pretty rapidly swept away. The Dutch government, and particularly their gallant queen, Wilhelmina, fled to Britain, where they set up wartime exile in London. The Belgians, a little to the south, had rather more forces. They had about 22 divisions mobilized in 1940, of which half were reservist divisions, and they played a rather more significant part and put up 18 days of defensive fight for their country. The British were assisting mostly the Belgians, because the British sent 10 divisions to France during the winter of 1939-40, who sat along the common Belgian-French border during that bitterly cold winter. Commanded by Lord Gort, 9 of those 10 divisions rushed forward into Belgium, trying to stiffen Belgian and Dutch resistance as the German offensive began on the 10th of May. So you get the picture, 10 Dutch divisions, 22 Belgian divisions, 10 British divisions, of which 9 moved forward into Belgium. And just so that we cover it briefly now, one, the 51st Highland Division, was on acclimatization duty with the French on the Maginot Line in 1940. And so it retreated along divergent lines from the rest of the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, as I'll call them now. And the Highland Division was nowhere near Dunkirk, could not be evacuated, was trapped with its back to the sea on the 12th of June 1940 at the tiny French Channel port of Saint-Valery-en-Caux by Rommel, he of the Desert Fox, and his 7th Panzer Division, and there the entire Highland Division, with what I think is the most ill-named commanding general of any unit ever in history, Major General Victor Fortune, was forced to surrender to Rommel, and all 12,000 of the Highland troops and General Fortune spent the rest of the war in German prisoner of war camps. The 51st Highland Division was later reconstituted with completely different units and troops based back in Britain, and took a distinguished part later in the war, but minus the original division. So then we come to the French army moving southwards, the French army holding by far the lion's share of the border, and the French army by far the largest part of the Allied dispositions. 110 French divisions, so 11 times greater than the British force or the Dutch force, and about 6 times larger than the Belgian force. 110 divisions had been mobilized by the spring of 1940 from a peacetime standing force of about 25 divisions. They'd been mobilized and organized into 24 corps, and disposed in 8 armies along the frontiers. The 8th of those armies, the most southerly of all, was actually watching the Italians on the Alpine and Provençal fronts south of Switzerland, because of course there was an axis, a kind of alliance, though not a full alliance as we would know NATO, for example. There was an axis, a relationship or partnership between Hitler and Mussolini. And the Allies, the French and British political leadership and military staffs, fully expected that at some point Italy would join the war. So the French 8th Army was screening the Italian frontier against that possibility. But the other 7 French armies, and the great bulk of their divisions, were on the frontiers from Switzerland up to the British Expeditionary Force on the border with Belgium. This army of metropolitan France consisted of 20 standing peacetime infantry divisions, very well trained. The corps, the cadre of them, represented by about 120,000 career soldiers, that is professionals, long service professionals, and the rest by the trained up conscripts who had got to the final 6 months of their compulsory military service, France being a nation that believed in staffing its military through the draft, as the Americans would say, through conscription. So the 20 standing peacetime infantry divisions and a number of other formations, which we'll come to, those were tripled up, those infantry divisions, casting off parts of their strength, their cadres, in 1939, in September 1939, to create 2 waves of reservist infantry divisions, the Series A divisions and the Series B divisions. The Series A divisions were pretty good in quality, officership, and equipment. They included a large number of active soldiers thrown off from the standing army divisions, and they included reservists who had fairly recently done their conscript time and returned to civilian life, who'd served between about 1934 and 1939. So were in 1940 about 25, 26, 27 years old. The B series reservist divisions, the third line of the main French divisions, was a rather different story. They were the older reservists, people who'd done their military service between the early 1920s and 1934-35. They were less well equipped, and the equipment they had was usually older equipment. So they were the last to receive the next generations of weapons or radio sets or vehicles. They also had a smaller proportion of career officers and NCOs to lead them. So they were less capable, less mobile, less well equipped. Those 60 divisions were backed up by 5 semi-mechanized cavalry divisions, each of which had an armored regiment, an armored car regiment, and a horse cavalry regiment. There were also 3 fully mechanized cavalry divisions with 2 tank regiments and a motorized infantry regiment. And there were 4 heavy armored divisions. One of those in 1940 was quite famously commanded by Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle, of whom we'll hear a little more later, and history would hear a lot more. There were 4 fortress divisions, static, very poorly equipped with transport, but well trained because they were part of the standing peacetime force designed to hold the frontiers against the danger of an unannounced surprise offensive or lightning strike by the Germans with insufficient notice for the French to do this full military mobilization. And that was a real fear of the French, what the French called an attaque brusquée, a sudden surprise attack, a kind of blitzkrieg before the term came along. The French were very worried about that during the 1930s, as their intelligence told them that Germans were rearming and increasingly concentrating on lightning strategies. So there was then the Maginot Line. I apologize for the missed M in the word Maginot. The Maginot Line, fortified sectors garrisons. They were very specialist troops, peacetime regulars, but they had no mobility. They were designed to hold the famous steel and concrete forts and interval positions of the Maginot Line defenses. And the Maginot Line had been built between 1929 and 1936 at a cost of about 7 billion French francs, and was designed to keep the Germans out from the vitally important industrial areas of Lorraine and eastern France, areas which were full of heavy industries, steel, manufacturing of all kinds, and which the loss of which would have crippled the French effort to fight a long war. In addition to these forces that were the Metropolitan Army, the French were reinforced by spring 1940 with units from their empire, from their colonies, from what the French called La France Outre-mer, overseas France, to the tune of 15 more divisions, 8 from North Africa, that is from French Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, and 7 colonial divisions from the wider French Empire, including particularly from French Black Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Ivory Coast, and Senegal being 2 of the richest recruiting grounds. This superimposed double map shows very quickly and easily the extent of the British Empire, the slightly larger map in the background, with, as you'd expect, the British territories across the world colored in red. And then the slightly smaller map shows, with all the little tricolor flags, the French colonies and territories dotted all around. And you see again the heavy concentration of French territories in Africa. And in truth, if India was known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, then North and West Africa, certainly in military recruitment terms, North and West Africa were the equivalent jewels in the French imperial crown. So British and French strategists could draw upon the resources and manpower of 2 vast empires. And really, we must not underestimate the importance of that. If I tell you that in 1919, after the German colonies had been stripped from them and parceled out to the victorious Allies by the Paris Peace Settlement, after that 1919 settlement, the British Empire, the King, Emperor George V, ruled over 1/4 of the world's human population. 500 million people out of a then global population in 1919 of 2 billion. And the French had a further 110 million people in their empire. These were formidable resources, and not just of people, but also of overseas economic assets, particularly raw materials, minerals, shipping, naval fleets, and all the things and the accoutrements and appurtenances that are essential if you want to have, run, and hold a large empire. So the work that I've been doing has adopted the military effectiveness approach or methodology that was really pioneered about 30 years ago by two Americans, Alan Millett, a former US Marine Corps colonel turned historian, and Williamson Murray. And the analytics that they provide allow us to look at themes in 1940, the themes being manpower, its number and quality, as I've been discussing, leadership, officership, especially at an operational and tactical level, equipment, training, morale, and the support echelons that are far too often overlooked in terms of a military's performance, whether that be an army, a navy, or an air force. The support echelons, the medical corps with the units, the supply, the veterinary services, the transport, the engineers. And then finally, one can look at the combat performance of the units. So against this kind of matrix, I've a number of embedded case studies which take this from a themed and rather abstract analysis of those issues, morale, training, equipment, officership, support echelons, through to real life experiences in the campaign in 1940. So I chose a number of divisions to look at in great depth, divisions of the French army. And the selection criteria for those you can see a proportionate sampling of each French army type. So, one heavy armored division, not 3 out of 4, and no fewer than 13 of those infantry divisions, again, divided as between peacetime standing infantry divisions, type A reservists and type B reservists. And then in terms of selection within those categories, the big data, if you like, triangulation against survivor diaries and memoirs, ground up views of what happened, allowed me to select particular divisions. So, which 13 infantry divisions did I want to look at? I had the run of the archives, which are very extensive, but then I wanted to see not just the top-down official paperwork, I wanted to get the view from on the ground, from soldiers and very junior officers as to what happened. And so that allowed me then to hone in on certain divisions within the categories of divisions rather than the other divisions. All of this generated, therefore, a top-down and bottom-up kind of autopsy of each of the formations, recruitments, leadership, armaments, and the use made of the phony war respite, the period between the collapse of Poland and the German offensive in May 1940. There were 8 months that went by, in which there were no active operations in the West. So what use was made of that? And then the morale and the effectiveness of the units in 1940. So let's look at the planning then that went on, particularly during that phony war. And I want to stress something again that's very neglected by scholars, is the weather. That was one of the 3 most vicious winters in the 20th century in Western Europe, the winter of 1939-40. The winter of 1929 was quite bad, but the winter of 1939-40 saw the sea all around the Kentish, Norfolk and Suffolk coasts freezing for anything up to half a mile out. There are some extraordinary pictures available if you go on Google Images. So it's right up there with the winter of 39-40, with the winters of 46-7 and 62-3, for harshest, hardest, longest winters of the 20th century. That's important because it severely handicapped attempts at further training and digestion of the lessons of the German success in Poland in September 1939. But of course, in the warm chateaus of the Allied command posts in Paris and in the War Office in London, it didn't prevent planning going ahead, nor did it in Germany. So the Germans developed what they called their Case Yellow or Fall-Gelb strategy to attack in the West when spring eventually came and dispersed the winter. And the Allies developed their own plan, which was called Plan D or Plan Deal, D-Y-L-E, after the river in Belgium, so that they could go forward, link up with the Belgians and perhaps the Dutch if they were brought into the war, and join up all the Allied forces to resist. The final Allied variant of a plan in the spring of 1940 offered a breeder variant, breeder in the Netherlands, onto the Deal plan. And that is what saw the push forward in May 1940 of the British Expeditionary Force, General Blanchard's 1st French Army, and General Henri Giraud's 7th French Army into Belgium and pushing on towards Tilburg and Breda in the southern Netherlands in an attempt to recuperate or incorporate those 32 Dutch and Belgian divisions into the Allied forces and thereby increase the chances of stalemating the German offensive and bogging them down. And the Maginot Line, meanwhile, was to provide screening to the south, the thick red line on this map. All this was the brainchild of the Allied Supreme Commander, French General Maurice Gamelin. What then was the German strategy to counter this? Well, it's often known as blitzkrieg, lightning war. Well, why did the Germans need to do things like lightning? Why did they need to do everything so quickly? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, because it was in the nature of Nazi ideology. The whole Nazi party's ideology and philosophy was one of nihilistic struggle. Win or be destroyed. There was no middle way. Their geopolitical expansionism was a kind of perversion of Karl von Clausewitz. So war became an instrument now, not so much of policy, but of ideology. Also, the Germans needed to move fast, they thought, because their leadership, and Adolf Hitler to the fore, profoundly distrusted ordinary Germans. Remember, actually, Hitler was an Austrian. He had a profound dislike and distrust of ordinary Germans, and particularly working class Germans, whom he, Hitler, a front soldier in the First World War on the Ypres salient, believed had sold the country down the river through the so-called November Revolution in 1918. Hitler subscribed to the belief that Germany had not been defeated in the First World War by Allied armies in the field, but that the German armies had been stabbed in the back, what was called the Dolchstoß, the stab in the back by Bolshevik, trade unionist, lefty socialists back in Germany, the efforts of the German army being undermined by the German people. So Hitler essentially did not trust the German people to hang in there for any other long war in 1939-1940. He believed the war would have to be won, and it would have to be won very quickly to avoid the kind of corrosion from within that had destroyed Germany in Hitler's view in 1918. So German rearmament in the later 1930s was broad, but not deep. It wasn't profound. Hitler did not really believe he could deprive the German people of butter just in order to give them more guns. He also had the advantage by 1940 that a number of new technologies that had been seen to good effect in 1917 and particularly in the hands of the Allies in August to November 1918, new technologies such as tanks, aircraft and radios, enabled new tactical approaches. These technologies were the tools or enablers of a swifter operational tempo, an operational level of war that would bring success in Poland in 1939 and would be repeated, with fingers crossed by the Germans, but it would be repeated, and it did bring success again in 1940. Contrastingly, the Franco-British strategy was utterly different. It was to combine economics, attrition, and a long haul to bring victory and to make time work for the Allies, whereas the Germans believed time, as had been seen in 1918, would only work against them. A long war for the Germans, Hitler was certain, would be very bad news. The French and British felt that as long as they could survive being completely knocked out in a short war, they were more or less guaranteed to win a long one. Remember those maps, the strength of the British and French empires, and the fact that we would win because we're the stronger. They were status quo powers too, Britain and France. They weren't seeking to upset anyone's apple carts. They were the established international order, And powers that run the world at any given time in history tend to want things to remain as they are. So the Allies had no great onus to do anything very dramatic or very radical. Modern war, the Great War experience seemed to suggest, would be unavoidably between first-class powers and industrial war, which would mean that it would be a long war with all national and imperial assets of finance, men, and manufacturers thrown into the melting pot and to bring victory in the end. We'll win because we're the stronger became a 1939-40 poster campaign in both Britain and France. And the design of it was to leverage the resources and assets of the two empires and the sea power of the two allies so as to defeat the Axis. Allied plans, therefore, and Allied institutions and resources were geared up not for a quick fix, but for a 4-year-long war, with no war-winning offensive even contemplated before about 1942 or 1943. This is the French version of the poster that I talked about, and the British version was plastered all over billboards in the UK. This is the French version. Nous vaincrons parce que nous sommes les plus forts. We'll win because we're stronger. And that's French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, who had been Minister of Finances before March 1940 and who subscribed emphatically to this philosophy, as did we, the British. Meanwhile, the Germans had used their campaign in Poland in September and early October 1939 as a kind of test bed, or a laboratory, if you will, an operational laboratory, codenamed Case White, Fall Weiss, for their combined use of armor and air power to assault an enemy. Now, geography gave the Germans in Poland an enormous advantage. A glance at this map shows you the purple and green areas on the left, the north and the west, shows that effectively Poland was surrounded on 3 sides when the Germans attacked it in 1939. I think no strategist in Poland, almost no amount of resources, could have saved that country from going under. And that was made certain when on the 17th of September 1939, the Soviets backstabbed the Poles by invading all those red arrows from the east, by invading at that point, the as yet unfought over eastern marches of Poland. So assailed from all 4 sides, the Polish fate was sealed. Poland's geostrategic situation was deplorably weak, even if they did make some errors, such as forward deploying far too many of their forces right up on their German frontier in the west. So they were really sitting ducks. Germany and the French did study the lessons to be learned from that campaign in Poland, and they had plenty of time to think about it, although not to do so much about it, because of that very harsh winter which set in late November 1939 all across Europe. So the plans continued to kind of simmer and to be distilled and to be given a stir. If you follow these around, the first one is actually the plan on the top right, the 19th of October 1939 German plan. And that's actually very much the sort of plan that the Allies would have been comfortable with. The Germans moving to seize the Netherlands and Belgium in order to establish forward bases for aircraft and indeed U-boats, submarines, in order to wage longer-term war. This didn't please Hitler. It was a military high command, German military high command plan. It didn't please Hitler because he knew that there would be no rapid, decisive victory in the war as a whole if they used that first plan, the one in the top right-hand picture. So the second plan was developed, which was a bit bolder, the one top left, which was a bit more aggressive and envisaged pushing on through Belgium into northern France. Again, however, it was likely that that would play into Allied hands by leading to a sort of Western Front 1915 situation, a stalemated slugfest in northern France and Belgium. The sort of stalemate long-haul war that Allied strategy was configured for, and Germany's society, thought Hitler, was not up to sustaining. So then, if we look finally at the other two, the third plan was bottom left, was General von Manstein's proposal in October 1939. Again, getting bolder, more German weight in the center, those shaded arrows that you can see under Army Group A in the middle. And then the final German iteration of the plan as modified, which is over on the right-hand side, little scheme D. So the Germans actually are trying to hedge their bets. They're trying to ensure that if they win, they win, but if they don't, they occupy Belgium and the Netherlands in order to have forward air bases and submarine bases to threaten Channel shipping, Allied transportation of further reinforcements of men and munitions from Britain, and of course to be able to menace the UK itself by air attack from forward bases in Belgium and the Netherlands. So how ready for war was France against that sort of German strategic planning? Well, the state of the French Air Force is worth thinking about. Secondly, the state of the French Army. Thirdly, the state of French political solidity. How robust was the French body politic? Was it ready for a fight? We already know that Hitler did not rate the German political morale and social stability very highly. What was the state then of French public opinion? So very briefly, the state of the French Air Force. The French Air Force was caught by the campaign in 1940 by having delayed its rearmament with very modern aircraft types. So it was not as far advanced in rearming, particularly not as far advanced in factory output reaching air squadrons on air bases as was the German Luftwaffe. On the other hand, the French aircraft were really very good. The trouble was there weren't yet enough of them in squadron service. And it was a period of immensely fast technological change for aircraft. An aircraft was obsolescent in 3 or 4 years, completely obsolete in 6 or 7. And this would come back to bite the Germans, particularly in 1941, 1942. But you first saw it in parts of the Battle of Britain in late summer 1940, when their aircraft, most of them first flying in 1934, 1935, were just not up to the job. They were barely up to it in the campaign in the West in 1940. They were not up to it by the middle period of the war. So the Germans, in one way, because they had to take the initiative, because they wanted a short, victorious war, the Germans, paradoxically, had rearmed too soon. And the French, hoping to get away, as the British did too, without a war at all, the French had delayed their air rearmament. So that French planes were only just rolling off the factories in high-quality modern machines, but were very good. So for the French, the campaign would have better come in 1941. For the Germans, a campaign in 1941 would have been an utter disaster. The state of the French army, well, I've already talked about that. Actually, it was really rather good. And the French army called the shots amongst the Allies because it was by far the biggest. Numbers talked. The state of French political robustness is trickier and harder to analyze. There were only the very first opinion polls in 1939. The American Gallup organization was starting to do opinion polls in the USA, was finding, of course, by the way, that Americans did not want to join in the war and help Britain and France. They wanted to stay neutral and continue with American business. One American politician actually said, America's business is business. The French political mood is also difficult to assess. The first of public opinion polls in France only take place in 1939. There was only one organization called IFOP, the Institut Français d'Opinion Publique, which is doing any at that time. So for the state of French political opinion, and British for that matter, historians largely have recourse to the speeches of MPs, some of whom get letters from their constituents, which they reflect sometimes in their speeches in Parliament, and historians have recourse to the newspapers. So insofar as we know about political opinion, we know about press opinion. And much of this work has been done by a former PhD student of mine, who's now an associate professor, Daniel Hucker, at Nottingham University. Now, the Allies, I've said, were less prepared than the Germans, or less advanced with their preparations than the Germans in the air. But it's not true that the skies were empty of Allied planes, for all that that's the impression you get in that 1940 Dunkirk film, in which I think it focuses on one Spitfire that comes to the aid of the British troops on the mole at Dunkirk. In actual fact, RAF losses and French Air Force losses were very heavy in extremely fierce fights over the beaches in many cases away from the beaches, because the Allies tried to intercept German attacks on the evacuating French and British troops at Dunkirk, intercept them east of the beaches. So of course the troops on the ground often didn't see the planes that were stopping German attacks from even reaching the evacuating forces. More to the point, a vast amount of damage, around about 22 to 25%, depending on the aircraft types you look at, a vast amount of damage was done to the German Air Force by the aerial fights over France and Belgium in May and June 1940. And the German reason for postponing their main assault on Britain in the air was because they had to refit, re-equip frontline squadrons, and bring up a lot more trained pilots and navigators from their air training schools back in Germany. Something, if you said as a roundabout, a ballpark figure, 22.5%, 23% of German air strength on the 10th of May had gone by the 25th of June 1940 and had to be replenished. So there was a fierce fight in the air. There was also plenty of fierce fighting on the ground. And again, the Allies had good tanks. The British Matilda infantry tank, although it was very slow, designed to move at the pace of a walking infantryman, was pretty much impervious to all German tank and anti-tank weaponry. A very good tank indeed. The French had lots of good ones too. The Char B1, the colored picture in the top left here, which had a 75mm hull-mounted gun with limited traverse and an excellent 47mm hydraulic turret-mounted gun as well. Armor, 60mm at the thinnest, up as far as 85mm on the frontal part and the turret of the tank. Again, impervious to German weaponry. The Saumur S-35, which is the top right tank here, again, an excellent weapon system, fast, reliable, modern, and with a powerful 47mm gun. Against this, many of the Germans, especially their Panzers Mark I and II, which was the basic weaponry of the Panzer divisions, they were armed only with machine guns. They were effectively motor machine gun carriers. The Germans had precious few of the really combat effective Panzer Mark IIIs and Panzer Mark IVs. And even a lot of them were equipped only with a short barreled, low velocity and pretty short range 50mm cannon. Not good against Matildas, Saumurs and Char Bs. So really the battle in 1940, strangely enough, was much more than many people think, like a rerun of many of the battles of 1914-18. The artillery was still queen of the battlefield, and the French artillery was recognized worldwide in 1939-1940 as being the best anywhere. French artillery, excellent. But the guns were still largely horse-drawn. There were many bicycle troops, and the supply wagons were nearly all horse-drawn. But then that was true in the German army as well. The German army, over 100 divisions strong, had just 10 panzer divisions and 2 Panzer Grenadier or mechanized infantry regiments out of over 100 divisions. The British small army, 10 divisions strong, was fully motorized and mechanized. The British troops were the only ones in 1940 who did not walk to the battle, but there were far too few of them. So the battle was still an infantryman's and a gunner's battle in 1940. The lay of the land was vitally important. So many of the actions that I've looked at in great detail through the war diaries in the archives, juxtaposed with the personal memoirs of infantry, non-commissioned officers and junior officers of the French divisions, show that key were roads, small bridges, waterways, and of course, as always, top left picture here, high ground with commanding positions for artillery observers. Not an awful lot had changed between 1914-18 and particularly 1918 and 1940. The French had really some excellent divisions who put up a really formidable fight against the Germans. 4 of the very best were their Alpine Divisions, 2 of which were switched up to the German front when it became clear that the Italians were not joining the war in May 1940. Although in one quip, the French Army Chief of Staff said to the 29th Alpine Division's commander, "You can leave your ski platoons in the Alps, General. You're not going to need them on the Somme." The generals of the French in 1940 who get the most attention are the sort of generals who found themselves forced to surrender, usually by being trapped by the Germans. So, for example, Henri Giraud, below left, commander of 7th Army, was captured forward in Belgium. The Fortress Corps general in the middle, because his corps was made up of those static Maginot Line divisions, which had no transport and couldn't move. Marcel Hiller, right, commander of 9th Corps, he was taken prisoner along with Major General Fortune at Saint-Valery on the 12th of June by Rommel. Those seem to be people who are cited again and again in books as being typical of a sclerotic French high command that was paralyzed by the Germans and unable to fight. But that's only part of the story. The French had lots of new commanders and new methods, and quite a few success stories they tell. One, I said we'd come back to him, was Charles de Gaulle, who was commanding the 4th of the French heavy tank divisions. And he very nearly, or his tanks, very nearly on the 19th of May 1940, captured the father of the German panzer divisions himself, General Heinz Guderian. They trapped Guderian with his armored command vehicle, nothing else, in a wood in France, near Compiègne, north of Paris, and he was out of contact with all of the rest of his Panzer Corps for 24 hours. If they could have bagged him on that, little detail, might have turned some part of the campaign. De Gaulle commanded his armored division with great dash and great skill. Commanding an infantry division, one of the regular peacetime infantry divisions, the 14th, was another general who then became a Marshal of France and was one of the great French heroes of the 1944-45 liberation campaign, Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. And he commanded the Free French First Army, which liberated Strasbourg in late 1944. And a couple of other generals are mentioned there too. And then a whole load of others, Charles Masse, Charles Roucault, Alphonse Join, became a Marshal of France and commanded all of French North Africa. Baudouin, Janel, Oblé, Boisseau, these were all excellent divisional commanders, major generals, whose divisions performed extremely capably against often numerically superior German forces in 1940. And there were also many spirited and able field officers, majors and half colonels, such as Loustonneau Lacco of the 12th Zouaves, Philippe de Hautecloque, Philippe Leclerc, famous for commanding the Foreign Legion in Chad and North Africa in the Desert War later in 1942, and Pierre Mesmer, who became French Prime Minister in 1972 to 1974. So why did the Allies lose? Well, they were preparing for a sort of different kind of war, or at least a different pace of war from the Germans. And I think tempo and speed was really the Achilles heel of the Allies, compounded by the fact that if things are moving fast, you need to be able to communicate fast. And the Germans could do that through the Enigma machines and wireless command vehicles, which they had attached to every divisional command post. And there on the left, you see Heinz Guderian, the commander of the Panzer Corps, in his command vehicle with the radio sets and the Enigma machine immediately front left. By contrast, and it's designed to emphasize the contrast, over on the right, we've got a French motorcycle dispatch rider taking messages, with him on his person to try to find somebody in a fast-moving battle and deliver orders or instructions to them. And we've also got French signals and communications guys tapping into the French PTT civilian telephone network in order to deal with the fact that the Germans often overran the telephone exchanges and cut the fixed landline communications. So mobile communications and signals on the German side and fixed chateau and telephone landline-based communications on the Allied side exacerbated the problem that the Allies had that the Germans were such fast movers in the first place. Also slowing the Allies down, especially as they began to get a grip on the nature of the war facing them, was the fact that there were about 1.8 million French and Belgian civilians clogging up the roads, fleeing the onrushing German armies. The plight of the civilian population is a hugely traumatic part of the 1940 operations. One French general, indeed it's that Alpine Division commander told to leave his ski troops in the Alps, offered a really graphic account, which I'll leave you to read there just for a moment, of some civilians whom he found. And it broke his heart that he could not stop to look after them because, of course, he had to follow his orders and move his division to their next deployment. So coming towards a conclusion, in 1940, I would suggest that the French and British found themselves with a winnable war on their hands, but perhaps not, and this will be open for discussion and your questions, perhaps not a winnable campaign, not at that stage, not with the forces and the strategies and the technologies and against the enemy that they faced. It's been suggested that the Allies surely had other strategic alternatives to simply rocking with the blow like some heavyweight boxer, trying not to be decked on the canvas and counted out, and then fighting on to win a long bout, if you want to keep a boxing metaphor. Surely they had alternatives. Why didn't they simply attack the Siegfried Line, the German West Wall, whilst the Germans were in Poland with the majority of their armies in September, October 1939? Well, I'll leave that as a question, which if it interests you, one of you will pick it up, I'm sure, and we can discuss. Second option, why didn't the RAF and the French Air Force bomb the Ruhr cities of Germany? Why didn't they take offensive air war to the heart of the Reich, as the Bomber Command and the US Army Air Force, 8th Air Force would do in 1943 and 1944? Again, there are all sorts of reasons why not. Let's come back to those if you're interested. Why not just stay on the defensive along the Franco-Belgian border? Well, that's easier to answer. It was politically and I think militarily impossible to discard those 32 Belgian and Dutch divisions that would have been the wrong side of the frontier had that strategy been pursued. You really could not spurn countries that were part of the Allied order of battle right from the outset. Why not draw in Roosevelt and the USA? Well, FDR had a big problem. FDR faced re-election in November 1940 for his, what we now know, became his third term in office. He'd first been elected in 1932. And Roosevelt knew very well, he could hardly not know, because there were senators standing up making speeches along these lines in Congress, people like Senator Vanderbilt and Senator Nye, emphasizing that at all costs, the USA must leave Europe to its own little local war. This was no business of the USA. The business of the US was business. Roosevelt knew that he could not get a congressional declaration of war to join the Allies any time before his November 1940 re-election. And every time he moved closer to helping the British and French, and he did make moves, he sent his Assistant Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, to London and Paris in March 1940. That, of course, leaked out into the press, and isolationists, stay-at-homers back in the United States, soon accused Roosevelt of back-scenes maneuvers to get the US into the war. And Roosevelt's ratings in the early Gallup polls plummeted. And the US documents, I did a lot of research some years ago in the USA, in the US National Archives, and in Roosevelt's own presidential archive at his former home on the Hudson River in upstate New York, Hyde Park. The research I did there turned up a lot of papers which make it very clear that in the spring and summer of 1940, Democrat strategists for Roosevelt's party feared that the election in November 1940, a third term for Frank, as Franklin FDR was called, could be lost. It could be lost. If you put too many feet wrong, too many false steps, and the isolationist Republicans could win that November 1940 election, blocking all further dollar credit and lend-lease arrangements with armaments and munitions to the Allies. So drawing in Roosevelt and the USA, I think, actually was a non-starter. And then finally, what about continuing the fight even after the battle in France was lost from French North Africa? Well, the problem with that was you needed an industrial base to wage a long modern war, and there was no industrial base in French North Africa. There was a lot of sand, but there was no industrial base. There were a lot of troops, but most of them had by May and June 1940 already been shipped by French troop transports across from Ers el Kebir and Tunis up to Marseille and thence by train to fight the Germans in northern France. So that option was really a pretty weak one too. In the end, I think the German advance and exploitation of its advance was simply too fast. War's tempo, not war's weapons, was what beat the West in 1940. So these 60 days really shook the West. The Germans used a different kind of operational war, which won the campaign, but would not ultimately win the struggle. Because as Karl von Clausewitz says in On War, and a very wise point amongst many, war is always a dynamic and interactive process. It's a kind of dialectic between attack and defense. If you like, the enemy always has a vote. You as a strategist are not acting upon some inert ectoplasm. Making strategy and war takes two to tango. Charles de Gaulle, who was the coming man in France, ultimately understood best the geo-realities obtaining in 1940 when he famously said, France has lost a battle, but France and the Allies have not lost this war. Okay, thank you very much. So happy to take any questions, comments, and whatever. How do I get back to seeing everybody, please?